The Hamas militant group claims responsibility for a deadly shooting in Jerusalem following an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank that killed 2 Palestinian children. Russia's Supreme Court effectively outlaws LGBTQ+ activism, a move that Amnesty International called shameful and absurd. Israeli police on the streets of Jerusalem after 2 gunmen opened fire at a bus stop on Thursday morning, killing 3 people and wounding 6 others. Israeli authorities say the assailants, 2 brothers, were neutralised at the scene. The Hamas militant group says the men were members of its armed wing and that the attack was in response to an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday. 2 boys, a 15-year-old and an 8-year-old, were shot dead in the city of Jenin. These pictures were taken at their funerals. 80 kilometres south in the city of Ramallah, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas shortly after meeting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. Abbas reportedly stressed the need for a complete ceasefire and for unity between Gaza and the West Bank. Netanyahu, on the other hand, doubled down after his meeting and reiterated in a video message his plans to eliminate Hamas and ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat. An emotional moment at an Israeli Air Force base as French-Israeli hostage Maya Sham embraces her mother and brother after being released by Hamas. The 21-year-old was the first captive to be shown in the hostage video, and she was released alongside another woman as a tentative truce between Israel and Hamas was extended into its 7th day. At least 10 Israelis a day, along with other nationals, have been released during the truce. Israel has released at least 30 Palestinian prisoners in return. Meanwhile, crowds gathered in front of the Defense Ministry headquarters in Tel Aviv to call for the release of all hostages held by Hamas in Gaza.
כל אחד ואחד מהחטופים והחטופות שלנו שנשארו מאחור בידי חמאס הם הילדים של אמא שלהם. אני לא מאחלת לאף אמא בעולם לקבל שיחת טלפון מהילדה הקטנה שלה שבה היא מתארת כמה היא מפחדת כי היא שומעת את המחבלים צועקים ויורים לה מחוץ לחדר.
During the rally, families of hostages prepared the favorite meals of their relatives who were taken during the October 7th attack that killed more than 1,200 people. At least 3 people were killed and 4 more were injured after an attack on the Kherson region on Thursday. Russian forces reportedly targeted residential buildings, critical infrastructure, and educational and medical facilities in the assault. This, as a spokesperson for the Bakhmut region, reported that the body of a man was recovered after an overnight attack that damaged a high-rise building. Earlier, 5 others were confirmed dead in the attack and 6 more were injured. A search and rescue operation is currently underway. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president visited a command post close to the front in the eastern Kharkiv region.
Я знаю, що ви втратили щоденно втрачаєте близьких людей, побратимів. Знаєте, що всі розуміють, що це найвища ціна. Я бажаю вам перемоги, бути міцними, не втрачати ініціативу, захищати Харківщину, захищати Куп'янськ, захищати кожне наше село, кожний квадратний метр нашої землі. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
During the visit, which marks the 2nd day of a countrywide tour, Zelensky awarded medals for defending the peaceful life in Ukraine. Russia's Supreme Court effectively outlawed LGBTQ+ activism on Thursday. Following a lawsuit by the Ministry of Justice, the court labeled what the suit called the LGBTQ+ movement as extremist and banned it. But the court's vague definition of the movement could allow officials to crack down on any individuals or groups deemed to be part of it.
Признать международное общественное движение ЛГБТ и его структурные подразделения экстремистскими и запретить их деятельность на территории Российской Федерации. Решение суда о запрете деятельности международного общественного движения ЛГБТ и его структурных подразделений подлежит немедленному исполнению.
Many in the LGBTQ+ community have responded to the court's decision with criticism, disapproval, and fear.
Но меня пугает то, какой большой пласт интересных идей, интересных людей и интересного творчества мы потеряем. Ну и, конечно же, я боюсь непосредственно за безопасность этих людей, потому что если они продолжают делать то, что они делают, то они могут оказаться под угрозой, и мне не хотелось бы, чтобы...
Просто для того, чтобы, во-первых, отвлечь внимание от войны, от тех неуспехов в войне, которые есть, а во-вторых, чтобы откреститься от Запада коллективного, который насаждает всю эту ЛГБТ-идеологию, рушит традиционные ценности и так далее.
This move also comes as Russia has ramped up its attacks on its LGBTQ+ community, including bans on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations and of gender-affirming care for transgender people.
Slap. In the future, we will hear this word more and more, which covers a complicated phenomenon: strategic lawsuits against public participation. The victims of these are usually journalists, employees of civil organisations and activists, and the lawsuits are typically initiated by large companies and politicians. The final position on the regulation proposed by the European Commission has now been agreed upon by Member States and the European Parliament.
Democracy cannot work without a free and independent media. This is why the Commission welcomes the political agreement reached by the European Parliament and the Council early this morning at 2:30 a.m. on the new EU rules to protect those targeted with strategic lawsuits against public participation, or as we call them, SLAPs.
The purpose of such lawsuits is to dissuade the sued person or entity from revealing connections and cases of suspected corruption in lengthy proceedings. Last year, 160 such cases were identified in the EU. The lead MEP on the topic says he's satisfied with the result.
Cross-border cases are covered by this new law, and we offer a high level of protection for journalists. They can claim also damages, for example, and there is an accelerated procedure in cases of manifestly unfounded cases, so the court proceeding can stop very quickly. This will save a lot of money, a lot of resources, and will help journalists in defending against SLAP cases.
It's important that member states will not recognise unfounded or abusive judgments made outside the EU. The application of the new law must begin in 2 years' time.
Sami Shukri, the president of last year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, announcing the opening of COP28 in Dubai, where UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is expected to deliver an urgent appeal. In an interview with AFP, Guterres said the time for slowing down is over.
The only thing that is still lacking is political will. And, I mean, this is why the COP is important, to make people understand that we are really moving in a very wrong direction still. We are heading, if nothing happens, to 3 degrees, and 3 degrees would be a total disaster.
Earlier this week, Guterres joined the annual UN and African Union conference in New York. He stressed the two bodies must work together on African-led solutions for African problems.
For that, for instance, we need to have a massive support to Africa. There is an absurdity. Africa has 60% of the solar capacity, and Africa has 2% of solar investment. So we need to create a global solar alliance for Africa.
Back in the Arab Emirate, activists gathered in support of vegan food policies. According to researchers, people who follow a plant-based diet generate 75% less greenhouse gas emissions a day than their meat-eating counterparts.
The European car industry is asking policymakers for a comprehensive industrial strategy and a reduction in the pace of new regulations over the next 5 years. They say otherwise the sector will find itself in a tough competitive position globally. The policy recommendations were part of a manifesto and roadmap by the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, unveiled at a press conference in Brussels. The strategy must encompass all steps of the green and digital supply chains, according to the organisation's president, Luca De Meo, who's also CEO of Renault.
I think we have a big idea. This is the Green Deal. And now we have to operationalize this thing. And we have to define, targets are defined, and we have to also decide on, who does what into this thing, who takes the responsibility based on which rules.
De Maio is particularly critical of the slow pace at which charging stations for electric vehicles are being established across the European Union. He says that if Europe is to keep up with China, the number of installations need to be increased by a factor of 7 to 10.
That thing cannot go completely on our shoulder. We can't do that alone as an automotive industry, because it's like, like 100 and more than 100 years ago, if, they would have asked us to, to control all the distribution of oil and gas. We didn't, right? So our job is to manufacture product, to develop technology, but we need to cooperation with others to do that.
The association also came out against the heavy regulatory burdens it's facing. Right now, the sector is confronted with 8 to 9 EU regulations coming into force every year until 2030, some of them conflicting. Looking ahead to next year, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association is forecasting a slowdown in new car sales compared to 2023, although the share of electric vehicles will sharply increase.
Shane MacGowan, the iconic frontman of the Irish folk rock band The Pogues, has died, aged 65, after a battle with viral encephalitis. His wife, Victoria Mary Clark, shared the last known photograph of the star on social media, days before they were due to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. He was in and out of hospital since July with the infection. British rock group The Jam and Ireland's president, Michael D. Higgins, offered their condolences on the social platform X. MacGowan famously penned the Pogues' biggest hit, Fairy Tale of New York, in 1987. One of Ireland's most popular Christmas songs.